4. Previous history of the UFO phenomenon. Though the UFOs were first publicized only towards the end of the Second World War, the phenomenon itself was known long before. It was observed in the first half of this century and was described in earlier centuries and perhaps even in antiquity. In the UFO literature, there are collections of reports from various sources which need critical evaluation. I shall spare myself this task and give the reader only 2 examples. Basil Broadsheet, 1566. This is from a broadsheet written by Samuel Coccius, student of the Holy Scripture and of the free arts at Basel in the fatherland in August 1566. He reports that on August 7 of that year, at the time of the sunrise, many large black globes were seen in the air, moving before the sun with great speed and turning against each other as if fighting. Some of them became red and fiery and afterwards faded and went out. As the illustration shows, this sighting was made in Basel. The dark color of the UFOs may be due to their having been seen against the light of the rising sun. Some of them were bright and fiery. Their speed and irregular motion are typical UFO features. Plate 6, Nuremberg broadsheet, 1561. This broadsheet relates the story of a very frightful spectacle seen by numerous men and women at sunrise on April 4, 1561. They saw globes of a blood red, bluish, or black color, or plates in large numbers near the sun, some 3 in a row now and then 4 in a square, also some standing alone. And amongst these globes, some blood-colored crosses were seen. Moreover, they were 2 great tubes. 3 in the picture, in which 3, 4, and more globes were to be seen. They all began to fight one another. This went on for about an hour. Then they all fell, as one sees in the picture, from the sun and sky down to the earth, as if everything were on fire. Then it slowly faded away on the earth, producing a lot of steam. Underneath the globes was a long object shaped like a great black spear. Naturally, this spectacle was interpreted as a divine warning. This report, as the reader will have noted, contains certain details already known to us. Above all the tubes, which are analogous to the cylindrical objects in the UFO reports, these in UFO language are the motherships which are said to carry the smaller, lens-shaped UFOs for long distances. The picture shows them in operation, releasing UFOs or taking them on board. Especially important, though lacking in the modern UFO reports, are the indubitable quantities, seen sometimes as simple crosses, sometimes as discs in the form of a cross, that is, as regular mandalas. There also seems to be a hint of the 3-to-1 motif in the dilemma of 3 and 4. The militaristic interpretation is as characteristic of the 16th century as the technological one is of ours. The tubes are cannons and the globes cannonballs, and the shooting to and fro of the globes is an artillery engagement. The great black spearhead, as well as the spear shafts, seem to represent the masculine element, especially in its penetrating capacity. Similar things are reported in the UFO literature. The emphasis on the cross motif is striking. The Christian meaning of the cross can hardly be considered here, since we are dealing with a natural phenomenon, a swarm of round objects in violent motion, shooting in opposite directions and reminding the reporter of a battle. If the UFOs were living organisms, one would think of a swarm of insects rising with the sun, not to fight one another, but to mate and celebrate the marriage. Here the cross signifies a union of opposites, vertical and horizontal, a crossing, as a plus sign. It is also a joining together, an addition. Where the globes are coupled together to form quaternities, they have given rise to the crossed marriage quaternary, which I have discussed in my Psychology of the Transference. It forms the model for the primitive cross-cousin marriage, but is also an individuation symbol, the union of the 4. Columns of smoke rise up from the place where the cannonballs have fallen, reminding us of Tangai's picture. The moment of sunrise, the aurora consurgens aquanis, Boyan, suggests the revelation of the light. Both reports have clear analogies, not only with one another, but also with the modern source of stories and with the individual products of the unconscious today. Plate 7, the spiritual pilgrim discovering another world, This 17th century woodcut, possibly representing a Rosicrucian illumination, comes from a source unknown to me. On the right, it shows the familiar world. The pilgrim, who is evidently on a pèlerinage de l'âme, has broken through the star-strewn rim of his world and beholds another supernatural universe filled with what look like layers of cloud or mountain ranges. In it appear the wheels of Ezekiel and discs or rainbow-like figures, obviously representing the heavenly spheres. In these symbols, we have a prototype of the UFO vision, which is vouchsafed to the Illuminati. They cannot be heavenly bodies belonging to our empirical world, but are projected rotunda from the inner, four-dimensional world. This is even more evident in the next picture, Plate 8. The quickening of the child in the womb, this picture, comes from the Rupertsberg Codex Severus, written by Hildegard of Bingen in the 12th century. It shows the quickening or animation of the child in the body of the mother. From a higher world, an influx enters the fortress. This upper world has a remarkable quadratic form divided into three to correspond with the Trinity, but unlike the latter, which is supposed to consist of three equal parts, the middle section is different from the other two. It contains round objects, whereas the other two are characterized by the eye motif. Like the wheels of Ezekiel, the little rotunda are associated with eyes. As Hildegard's text states, the radiance of the countless eyes, there are in reality 24 in each section, means God's knowledge. That is, his seeing and knowing, with reference to the 7 eyes of God that ran to and fro through the whole earth, the Chara. 4, the rotunda, on the other hand, are God's deeds, such as the sending of his Son as a Savior. Hildegard adds, all, the bad as well as the good, appear in God's knowledge, for it is not ever clouded round by any darkness. The souls of men are fireballs, so presumably the soul of Christ was also such a ball. For Hildegard interprets her vision not with reference to the growth of a human child only, but with particular reference to Christ and the Mother of God. The square divided into 3 stands for the Holy Ghost entering into the child. The procreative aspect of the Holy Ghost unites the Godhead with matter, as is clear from the sacred legend. The intermediate forms between spirit and matter are obviously the rotunda, early stages of animated bodies, filling the middle section of the square. There are 30 of them, and however accidental this may be, the number 30 days of the month suggests the moon, ruler of the helical world, whereas 24 hours of the day suggests the sun, the king. This indicates the motive of the Comanche, an instance of that unconscious readiness which later came to expression in Cusanus' definition of God as a complexio oppositorum. In the miniature, the rotunda are fire-colored, the fiery seeds from which human beings will sprout, a sort of pinatic roll. This comparison is justified insofar as alchemy compares the rotunda to fish's eyes. The eyes of a fish are always open like the eyes of God. They are synonymous with the scintillae, soul sparks. It is just possible that these alchemical illusions crept into Hildegard's text by the atoms of Democritus. Another such source may be responsible for the squareness of the Holy Ghost. The square, being a quaternity, is a totality symbol in alchemy. Having 4 corners, it signifies the earth, whereas a circular form is attributed to the spirit. Earth is feminine, spirit masculine. The square, as a symbol of the spiritual world, is certainly most unusual, but becomes more intelligible when we take Hildegard's sex into account. This remarkable symbolism is reflected in the squaring of the circle, another conjunctio oppositorum, squareness. In alchemy is an important feature of the unitary substance, the Mercurius philosophorum sive quadratus, and characterizes its chapstonic nature, which it possesses along with spirituality, spiritus mercurialis. It is as much a metal as a spirit. Correspondingly, in Christian dogma, the Holy Ghost, as the 3rd person of the Trinity, does not remain a prerogative of the incarnate God, but may descend also upon sinful man. Though these ideas were not yet explicitly conscious in Hildegard's day, they were implicitly present in the collective unconscious, activated by the Christa Collecurus analogy. This reached consciousness in the next century, but had been clearly anticipated in the writings of Zosimos of Panopolis in the 3rd century AD. We must emphasize, however, that there can hardly be any historical connection between the two. It is more a question of the activated archetype of the primordial man or an anthropos. Equally characteristic of alchemy is the arithmetical structure of the Holy Ghost. He is a unity, consists of 2 principal eyes and fireballs, has 3 parts, and is a square. This motif is known under the name of the axiom of Maria, who lived in Alexandria in the 3rd century and played a great role in classical alchemy. The 2 human groups in the picture typify the fates that preside over the awakening of the soul. They are, as Hildegard says, people who prepare good or middling or bad cheese. The devil, too, has a hand in the game. The picture shows clearly, like the previous one, that the eyes and fireballs are not identical with the heavenly bodies and are differentiated from the stars in the background. It confirms that the fireballs are souls. Summary from the dream examples and the pictures, it is evident that the unconscious, in order to portray its contents, makes use of certain fantasy elements which can be compared with the UFO phenomenon. In dreams 1, 2, 6, and 7, and in the painting of the fire sower, the connection with UFOs was conscious, while in the other dreams, and in 2 of the paintings, no conscious connection could be proved. The personal relationship between the UFO and the observing dream subject was stressed in some of the dreams, but this is completely lacking in the paintings. In medieval paintings, the personal participation in an epiphany or in such like visionary experiences is expressed by the visible presence of the recipient of the vision. This view does not fit at all into the program of modern art, which is more concerned to put as great a distance as possible between the object and the spectator, like the Rorschach ink blot, which is intentionally touchist in order to avoid any suggestion of meaning and to produce a purely subjective phantasm. The dreams, as well as the paintings, when subjected to careful scrutiny, yield a meaningful content which could be described as an epiphany. In the fire sower, this meaning can be recognized without difficulty. In the other cases, an investigation in the light of comparative psychology leads to the same conclusion. For those unacquainted with the psychology of the unconscious, I must emphasize that my conclusions are not the product of unbridled fantasy, as is often supposed, but are based on thorough researches into the history of symbols. It was merely in order to avoid overloading my text with annotations that I omitted practically all the references to source material. Anyone, therefore, who feels the need to test the correctness of my conclusions will have to go to the trouble of familiarizing himself with my other writings. The amplificatory method I have used for interpreting the meaning has proved fruitful when applied to historical as well as contemporary material. In the present instance, it seems to me sufficiently safe to conclude that in my examples a central archetype consistently appears, which I have called the archetype of the self. It takes a traditional form of an epiphany from heaven, whose nature in several cases markedly antithetical, e.g., fire and water, corresponding to the Star of David, which consists of fire and water. The hexad is a totality symbol. 4 as the natural division of the circle. 2 is the vertical axis, zenith and nadir, a spatial conception of totality. As a modern development of this symbol, we would cite the 4th dimension in plates 2 and 3. The masculine-feminine antithesis appears in the long and round objects, cigar form and circle. These may be sexual symbols. The Chinese symbol of the one being Tao consists of yang, fire, hot, dry, south side of the mountain, masculine, etc. And yin, dark, moist, cool, north side of the mountain, feminine. It fully corresponds, therefore, to the Jewish symbol mentioned above. The Christian equivalent can be found in the Church's doctrine of the unity of mother and son and in the androgyny of Christ, not to mention the hermaphroditic primordial being in many Oriental and primitive religions, the father-mother. The Gnostics and the Mercurius hermaphroditus of alchemy. The 3rd antithesis is between above and below, as in plate 3, where it seems to have been moved into the 4th dimension. In the other examples, it constitutes the difference between what happens in the heavens and down below on earth. The 4th antithesis, unity and quaternity, appears united in the quincunx, the 4 forming, as it were, a frame for the one, accentuated as the center. In the history of symbols, quaternity is the unfolding of unity. The one universal being cannot be known because it is not differentiated from anything and cannot be compared with anything. By unfolding into four, it acquires distinct characteristics and can therefore be known. This is not a metaphysical argument, but simply a psychological formula for describing the process by which an unconscious content becomes conscious. So long as a thing is in the unconscious, it has no recognizable qualities and is consequently merged with the universal unknown, with the unconscious all and nothing, with what the Gnostics called a non-existent all-being. But as soon as the unconscious content enters the sphere of consciousness, it has already split into the four. That is to say, it can become an object of experience only by virtue of the four basic functions of consciousness. It is perceived as something that exists, sensation. It is recognized as this and distinguished from that. Thinking, it is evaluated as pleasant or unpleasant, etc. Feeling, and finally intuition tells us where it came from and where it is going. This cannot be perceived by the senses or thought by the intellect. Consequently, the object's extension in time and what happens to it is the proper concern of intuition. The splitting into four has the same significance as the division of the horizon into 4 quarters or of the year into 4 seasons. That is, through the act of becoming conscious, the 4 basic aspects of a whole judgment are rendered visible. This naturally does not mean that the speculative intellect could not equally well think up 360 other aspects. The 4 we have named are nothing more than a natural, minimal division of the circle or totality. In my work with patients, the quaternity symbol crops up very frequently, the pentat very rarely, and rather less rarely the triad. Since my practice was always cosmopolitan, I had plenty of occasion for comparative ethnological observations, and it struck me that the triadic mandalas invariably came from Germans. This seemed to me to have some connection with the fact that, compared with French and Anglo-Saxon literature, the typical anima figure in German novels plays a relatively insignificant role. From a totality standpoint, the triadic mandala has a 4-1 structure as opposed to the usual 3+1. The 4th function is the undifferentiated or inferior function, which characterizes the shadow side of the personality. When this is missing in the totality symbol, there is too much emphasis on the conscious side. The 5th antithesis concerns the contrast between an enigmatic higher world and the ordinary human world. This is the most important polarity, which is illustrated in all the examples and can therefore be taken as fundamental both to the dreams and to the pictures. The contrast seems to be intentional as well as being very striking, and, if we take this feeling into account, appears to convey something like a message. The horizontal axis of our empirical consciousness, which except for psychic contents, is aware only of bodies in motion, is crossed by another order of being, a dimension of the psychic. For the only statements we can safely make about this other order refer to the psychic. Something on the one hand mathematically abstract, and on the other hand fabulous and mythological. Now, if we conceive numbers as having been discovered and not merely invented as an instrument for counting, then on account of their mythological nature, they belong to the realm of godlike human and animal figures and are just as archetypal as they. Unlike these, however, they are real in the sense that they are encountered in the realm of experience as quantities and thus form the bridge between the tangible physical world and the imaginary. Though the latter is unreal, it is real insofar as it works, i.e., has an effect on us. There can be no doubt about its effectiveness, particularly at the present time. It is not the behavior, the lack or surplus of physical things that directly affects humanity, so much as the idea we have of them, or the imaginary ideas by which we are obsessed. The role that numbers play in mythology and in the unconscious gives food for thought. They are an aspect of the physically real as well as of the psychically imaginary. They do not only count and measure and are not merely quantitative. They also make qualitative statements and are therefore a mysterious something midway between myth and reality, partly discovered and partly invented. Equations, for instance, that were invented as pure mathematical formulae have subsequently proved to be formulations of the quantitative behavior of physical things. Conversely, owing to their individual qualities, numbers can be vehicles for psychic processes in the unconscious. The structure of the mandala, for instance, is intrinsically mathematical. we may exclaim with the mathematician Jacobi, "In the Olympian host number eternally reigns." These hints are merely intended to point out to the reader that the opposition between the human world and the higher world is not absolute. The two are only relatively incommensurable, for the bridge between them is not entirely lacking. Between them stands the great mediator, number, whose reality is valid in both worlds as an archetype in its very essence. Deviation into theosophical speculation does not help us to understand the splitting of the world picture indicated in our examples. For this is simply a matter of names and words which do not point the way to the annus mundus vitare world. Number, however, belongs to both worlds, the real and the imaginary. It is visible as well as invisible, quantitative as well as qualitative. Thus, it is a fact of singular importance that number also characterizes the personal nature of the mediating figure, that appears as a mediator. From the psychological standpoint, and having regard to the limits set to all scientific knowledge, I have called the mediating or uniting symbol which necessarily proceeds from a sufficiently great tension of opposites, the self. I chose this term in order to make clear that I am concerned primarily with the formulation of empirical facts and not with dubious incursions into metaphysics. There I would trespass upon all manner of religious convictions. Living in the West, I would have to say Christ instead of self. In the Near East, it would be Kidda. In the Far East, Atman or Tao or the Buddha. In the Far West, maybe a hare or a mondamin. And in Kabbalism, it would be Tefer. Our world has shrunk, and it is dawning on us that humanity is one, with one psyche. Humility is a not inconsiderable virtue which should prompt Christians, for the sake of charity, the greatest of all virtues, to set a good example and acknowledge that though there is only one truth that speaks in many tongues, and that if we still cannot see this, it is simply due to lack of understanding. No one is so godlike that he alone knows the true word. All of us gaze into that dark glass in which the dark myth takes shape, adumbrating the invisible truth. In this glass, the eyes of the spirit glimpse an image which we call the self, fully conscious of the fact that it is an anthropomorphic image which we have merely named but not explained. By self, we mean psychic wholeness, but what realities underlie this concept we do not know, because psychic contents cannot be observed in their unconscious state, and moreover the psyche cannot know itself. The conscious can know the unconscious only so far as it has become conscious. We have only a very hazy idea of the changes an unconscious content undergoes in the process of becoming conscious, but no certain knowledge. The concept of psychic wholeness necessarily implies an element of transcendence on account of the existence of unconscious components. Transcendence in this sense is not equivalent to a metaphysical postulate or hypostasis. It claims to be no more than a borderline concept, to quote Kant, that there is something beyond the borderline, beyond the frontiers of knowledge, is shown by the archetypes and most clearly of all by numbers, which this side of the border are quantities, but on the other side are autonomous psychic entities, capable of making qualitative statements which manifest themselves in a priori patterns of order. These patterns include not only quasi-explicable phenomena like dream symbols and such, but remarkable relativizations of time and space, which simply cannot be explained causally. They are the parapsychological phenomena which I have summed up under the term synchronicity and which have been statistically investigated by Ryan. The positive results of his experiments elevate these phenomena to the rank of undeniable facts. This brings us a little nearer to understanding the mystery of psychophysical parallelism, for we now know that a factor exists which mediates between the apparent incommensurability of body and psyche, giving matter a kind of psychic faculty, and the psyche a kind of materiality, by means of which the one can work on the other. That the body can work on the psyche seems to be a truism, but strictly speaking, all we know is that any bodily defect or illness also expresses itself psychically. Naturally, this assumption only holds good if, contrary to the popular materialistic view, the psyche is credited with an existence of its own. But materialism in its turn cannot explain how chemical changes can produce a psyche. Both views, the materialistic as well as the spiritualistic, our metaphysical prejudices. It accords better with experience to suppose that living matter has a psychic aspect and the psyche a physical aspect. If we give due consideration to the facts of parapsychology, then the hypothesis of the psychic aspect must be extended beyond the sphere of biochemical processes to matter in general. In that case, all reality would be grounded on an as yet unknown substrate possessing material and at the same time psychic qualities. In view of the trend of modern theoretical physics, this assumption should arouse fewer resistances than before. It would also do away with the awkward hypothesis of psychophysical parallelism and afford us an opportunity to construct a new world model closer to the idea of the annus mundus. There are causal correspondences between mutually independent psychic and physical events, i.e. synchronistic phenomena, and in particular psychokinesis would then become more understandable, for every physical event would involve a psychic one and vice versa. Such reflections are not idle speculations. They are forced on us in any serious psychological investigation of the UFO phenomenon, as the next chapter will show. 5. UFOs considered in a non-psychological light. As I said at the beginning, it was the purpose of this essay to treat the UFOs primarily as a psychological phenomenon. There were plenty of reasons for this, as is abundantly clear from the contradictory and impossible assertions made by the rumor. It is quite right that they should meet with criticism, skepticism, and open rejection, and if anyone should see behind them nothing more than a phantasm that deranges the minds of men and engenders rationalistic resistances, he would have nothing but our sympathy. Indeed, since conscious and unconscious fantasy and even mendacity obviously play an important role in building up the rumor, we could be satisfied with a psychological explanation and let it rest at that. Unfortunately, however, there are good reasons why the UFOs cannot be disposed of in this simple manner. So far as I know, it remains an established fact, supported by numerous observations, that UFOs have not only been seen visually, but have also been picked up on the radar screen and have left traces on the photographic plate. I base myself here not only on the comprehensive reports by Ruppert and Kehoe, which leave no room for doubt in this regard, but also on the fact that the astrophysicist, Professor Menzel, has not succeeded, despite all his efforts, in offering a satisfying scientific explanation of even one authentic UFO report. It boils down to nothing less than this: that either psychic projections throw back a radar echo, or else the appearance of real objects affords an opportunity for mythological projections. Here I must remark that even if the UFOs are physically real, the corresponding psychic projections are not actually caused, but are only occasioned by them. Mythical statements of this kind have always occurred, whether UFOs exist or not. These statements depend in the first place on the peculiar nature of the psychic background, the collective unconscious, and for this reason have always been projected in some form. At various times, all sorts of other projections have appeared in the heavens besides the sources. This particular projection, together with its psychological context, the rumor, is specific of our age and highly characteristic of it. The dominating idea of a mediator and God who became man, after having thrust the old polytheistic beliefs into the background, is now in its turn on the point of evaporating. Untold millions of so-called Christians have lost their belief in a real and living mediator, while the believers endeavor to make their belief credible to primitive people, when it would be so much more fruitful to bestow these much-needed efforts on the white man. But it is always so much easier and more affecting to talk and act down to people instead of up to them. St. Paul spoke to the populace of Athens and Rome, but what is Albert Schweitzer doing in Lamborghini? People like him are needed much more urgently in Europe. No Christian will contest the importance of a belief like that of the mediator, nor will he deny the consequences which the loss of it entails. So powerful an idea reflects a profound psychic need, which does not simply disappear when the expression of it ceases to be valid. What happens to the energy that once kept the idea alive and dominant over the psyche? A political, social, philosophical, a religious conflict of unprecedented proportions has split the consciousness of our age. When such tremendous opposites split asunder, we may expect with certainty that the need for a savior will make itself felt. Experience has amply confirmed that. In the psyche as in nature, a tension of opposites creates a potential which may express itself at any time in a manifestation of energy. Between above and below flows a waterfall, and between hot and cold there's a turbulent exchange of molecules. Similarly, between the psychic opposites there is generated a uniting symbol, at first unconscious. This process is running its course in the unconscious of modern man. Between the opposites there arises spontaneously a symbol of unity and wholeness, no matter whether it reaches consciousness or not. Should something extraordinary or impressive then occur in the outside world, be it a human personality, a thing, or an idea, the unconscious content can project itself upon it, thereby investing the projection carrier with numinous and mythical powers. Thanks to its numinosity, the projection carrier has a highly suggestive effect and grows into a savior myth whose basic features have been repeated countless times. The impetus for the manifestation of the latent psychic contents was given by the UFO. The only thing we know with tolerable certainty about UFOs is that they possess a surface which can be seen by the eye and at the same time throws back a radar echo. Everything else is so uncertain that it must remain for the time being an unproven conjecture or rumor until we know more about it. We do not know either whether they are man machines or a species of living creature which has appeared in our atmosphere from an unknown source. It is not likely that they are meteoric phenomena, since their behavior does not give the impression of a process that could be interpreted in physical terms. Their movements indicate volition and psychic relatedness, e.g., evasion and flight, perhaps even aggression and defense. Their progression in space is not in a straight line and of constant velocity like a meteor, but erratic like the flight of insect and of varying velocity from 0 to several thousand miles per hour. The observed speeds and angles of turn are such that no earthly being could survive them any more than he could the enormous heat generated by friction. The simultaneous visual and radar sightings would in themselves be a satisfactory proof of their reality. Unfortunately, well-authenticated reports show that there are also cases where the eye sees something that does not appear on the radar screen, or where an object undoubtedly picked up by radar is not seen by the eye. I will not mention other, even more remarkable reports from authoritative sources. They are so bizarre that they tax our understanding and credulity to the limit. If these things are real, and by all human standards it hardly seems possible to doubt this any longer, then we are left with only two hypotheses. That of their weightlessness on the one hand, of their psychic nature on the other. This is a question I, for one, cannot decide. In the circumstances, however, it seemed to me advisable at least to investigate the psychological aspect of the phenomenon so as to throw a little light on this complicated situation. I've limited myself to only a few examples. Unfortunately, after more than 10 years' study of the problem, I have not managed to collect a sufficient number of observations from which more reliable conclusions could be drawn. I must therefore content myself with having sketched out a few lines for future research. Of course, next to nothing has been gained as regards a physical explanation of the phenomenon, but the psychic aspect plays so great a role that it cannot be left out of account. The discussion of it, as I have tried to show, leads to psychological problems which involve just as fantastic possibilities or impossibilities as the approach from the physical side. If military authorities have felt compelled to set up bureaus for collecting and evaluating UFO reports, then psychology, too, has not only the right, but also the duty to do what it can to shed light on this dark problem. The question of anti-gravity is one which I must leave to the physicists, who alone can inform us what chances of success such an hypothesis has. The alternative hypothesis that UFOs are something psychic that is endowed with certain physical properties seems even less probable, for where should such a thing come from? If weightlessness is a hard proposition to swallow, then the notion of a materialized psychism opens a bottomless void under our feet. Parapsychology is, of course, acquainted with the fact of materialization. But this phenomenon depends on the presence of one or more mediums who exude a weighable substance, and it occurs only in their immediate vicinity. The psyche can move the body, but only inside the living organism. That's something psychic, possessing material qualities and with a high charge of energy, could appear by itself high in the air at a great distance from any human mediums. This surpasses our comprehension. Here our knowledge leaves us completely in the lurch, and it is therefore pointless to speculate any further in this direction. It seems to me, speaking with all due reserve, that there is a third possibility, that UFOs are real material phenomena of an unknown nature, presumably coming from outer space, which perhaps have long been visible to mankind, but otherwise have no recognizable connection with the Earth or its inhabitants. In recent times, however, and just at the moment when the eyes of mankind are turned towards the heavens, partly on account of their fantasies about possible spaceships, and partly in a figurative sense because their earthly existence is threatened, unconscious contents have projected themselves on these inexplicable heavenly phenomena and given them a significance they in no way deserve. Since they seem to have appeared more frequently after the Second World War than before, it may be that they are synchronistic phenomena or meaningful coincidences. The psychic situation of mankind and the UFO phenomena of physical reality bear no recognizable causal relationship to one another, but they seem to coincide in a meaningful manner. The meaningful connection is the product, on the one hand, of projection, and on the other, of round and cylindrical forms which embody the projected meaning and have always symbolized the union of opposites. Another equally chance coincidence is the choice of the national emblems for aircraft in the USA and the US respectively, a red and white five-pointed star. For 1,000 years, red was regarded as the masculine and white as the feminine color. The alchemists spoke of the Cervus rubeo as a slave and the feminine candida a white woman. Their copulation produced a prim union of opposites. When one speaks of Russia, one immediately thinks of little Father Tsar and little Father Stalin. One also remembers all the talk about America being a matriarchy because the bulk of American capital is in the hands of women, not to mention Kieserling's bon mot about the aunt of the nation. It is clear that these parallels have nothing to do with the choice of symbols, at any rate, not as a conscious causality. Comically enough, one must say red and white are the nuptial colors. They throw an amusing light on Soviet Russia as the reluctant or unrequited lover of the feminine candidate in the White House, even if there's nothing more to it than that. Epilogue. I had already completed my manuscript when a little book fell into my hands which I ought not to leave unmentioned. The Secret of the Saucers by Orfeo M., annualized in 1905. The author is self-taught and describes himself as a nervous individual suffering from constitutional inadequacy. After working at various jobs, he was employed as a mechanic in 1952 at the Lockheed Aircraft Corporation at Burbank, California. He seems to lack any kind of humanistic culture, but appears to have a knowledge of science that exceeds what would be expected of a person in his circumstances. He is an Americanized Italian, naive and if appearances do not deceive us, serious and idealistic. He makes his living now by preaching the gospel revealed to him by the sources. That is the reason why I mention his book. His career as a prophet began with the sighting of a supposedly authentic USO on August 4, 1946. At the time, he had no further interest in the problem. He was working in his free hours on a book entitled The Nature of Infinite Entities, which he subsequently published at his own expense. He describes its content as atomic evolution, suspension, and involution, origin of the cosmic rays, etc. On May 23, 1952, he underwent the experience that gave him his calling. Towards 11 o'clock in the evening, he says he felt unwell and had a prickling sensation in the upper half of his body as before an electrical storm. He was working the night shift, and as he was driving home in his car, he saw a faintly red-glowing, oval-shaped object hovering over the horizon, which nobody else seemed to see. On a lonely stretch of the road, where it rose above the level of the surrounding terrain, he saw below him the glowing red disk pulsating near the ground only a short distance away. Suddenly, it shot upwards with great speed at an angle of 30 to 40 degrees and disappeared towards the west. But before it vanished, it released two balls of green fire from which a man's voice issued, speaking perfect English. He could remember the words. "Don't be afraid, Orfeo, we are friends." The voice bade him get out of the car. This he did, and leaning against the car, He watched the two pulsating discs hovering a short distance in front of him. The voice explained to him that the lights were instruments of transmission and reception, ID, a species of sense organs, and that he was in direct communication with friends from another world. It also asked him if he remembered his experience on August 4, 1946. All at once he felt very thirsty, and the voice told him, "Drink from the crystal cup you will find on the fender of your car." He drank, and it was the most delicious beverage I had ever tasted. He felt refreshed and strengthened. The twin discs were about 3 feet apart. Suddenly the area between them began to glow with a soft green light, which gradually formed into a luminous 3-dimensional screen. In it there appeared the heads and shoulders of 2 persons, a man and a woman, being the ultimate of perfection. They had large, shining eyes, and despite their supernatural perfection, they seemed strangely familiar to him. They observed him and the whole scene. It seemed to him that he was in telepathic communication with them. As suddenly as it had come, the vision vanished and the fireballs reassumed their former brilliance. He heard the words, "The road will open, Orfeo," and the voice continued, "We see the individuals of Earth as each one really is, Orfeo, and not as perceived by the limited senses of man. The people of your planet have been under observation for centuries, but have only recently been resurveyed. Every point of progress in your society is registered with us. We know you as you do not know yourselves. Every man, woman, and child is recorded in vital statistics by means of our recording crystal discs. Each of you is infinitely more important to us than to your fellow earthlings because you are not aware of the true mystery of your being. We feel a deep sense of brotherhood toward Earth's inhabitants because of an ancient kinship of our planet with Earth. In you, we can look far back in time and recreate certain aspects of our former world. With deep compassion and understanding, we have watched your world going through its growing pains. We ask that you look upon us simply as older brothers. The author is also informed that the UFOs were remote controlled by a mothership. The occupants of UFOs needed in reality no such vessels. Etheric entities, they needed them only in order to manifest themselves materially to man. The UFOs could travel approximately with the speed of light. The speed of light is the speed of truth A, quickest thought. The heavenly visitors were harmless and filled with the best intentions. Cosmic law forbade spectacular landings on Earth. The Earth was at present threatened by greater dangers than was realized. After these revelations, Angelaki felt exalted and strengthened. It was as though momentary I had transcended mortality and was somehow related to these superior beings. When the lights disappeared, it seemed to him that the everyday world had lost its reality and become an abode of shadows. On July 23, 1952, he felt unwell and stayed away from work. In the evening, he took a walk, and on the way back, in a lonely place, similar sensations came over him as he had felt on May 23. Combined with them was the dulling of consciousness I had noted on that other occasion, i.e. the awareness of an abasement du niveau mental, a state which is a very important precondition for the occurrence of spontaneous psychic phenomena. Suddenly he saw a luminous object on the ground before him, like an igloo or a huge, misty soap bubble. This object visibly increased in solidity, and he saw something like a doorway leading into a brightly lit interior. He stepped inside and found himself in a vaulted room, about 18 feet in diameter. The walls were made of some ethereal mother-of-pearl stuff. Facing him was a comfortable reclining chair consisting of the same translucent, shimmering substance. Otherwise, the room was empty and silent. He sat down and had the feeling that he was suspended in air. It was as if the chair molded itself to the shape of his body of its own accord. The door shut, as if there had never been a door there at all. Then he heard a kind of humming, a rhythmical sound like a vibration, which put him into a kind of semi-dream state. The room grew dark, and music came from the walls. Then it grew light again. He found on the floor a piece of metal like a coin. When he took it in his hand, it seemed to diminish in size. He had the feeling that the UFO was carrying him away. Suddenly, something like a round window opened, about 9 feet in diameter. Outside, he saw a planet, the Earth. From a distance of over 1,000 miles, as a voice he recognized explained to him. He wept with emotion, and the voice said, "Weep, Orfeo. We weep with you for Earth and her children. For all its apparent beauty, Earth is a purgatorial world among the planets evolving intelligent life. Hate, selfishness, and cruelty rise from many parts of it like a dark mist." Then he says, the craft evidently moved out into cosmic space. Through the window he saw a UFO about 1,000 feet long and 90 feet thick, consisting of a transparent crystalline substance. Music poured from it, bringing visions of harmoniously revolving planets and galaxies. The voice informed him that every being on Earth was divinely created, and upon your world, the mortal shadows of those entities are working out their salvation from the plane of darkness. All these entities were either on the good side or on the bad. "We know where you stand, Orfeo." Owing to his physical weakness, he had spiritual gifts, and that was why the heavenly beings could enter into communication with him. He was given to understand that the music as well as the voice emanated from this huge spaceship. It moved off slowly, and he noticed at either end of it vortices of flame that served as propellers, but there were also instruments for seeing and hearing through some method of telepathic contact. On the way back, they met two ordinary UFOs traveling earthwards. The voice entertained him with more explanations concerning the attitude of the higher beings to mankind. Man had not kept pace morally and psychologically with his technological development, and therefore the inhabitants of other planets were trying to instill into the Earth dwellers a better understanding of their present predicament and to help them particularly in the art of healing. They also wanted to put Orfeo right about Jesus Christ. Jesus, so they said, was called allegorically the Son of God. In reality, he was the Lord of the Flame, an infinite entity of the sun and not of earthly origin. As the Sun Spirit who sacrificed himself for the children of woe, he has become a part of the oversoul of mankind and the Word Spirit. In this he differs from all other cosmic teachers. Everyone on earth has a spiritual, unknown self which transcends the material world and consciousness and dwells eternally outside of the time dimension in spiritual perfection within the unity of the Oversoul. The sole purpose of human existence on earth is to attain reunion with the immortal consciousness. Under the searching eye of this great compassionate consciousness, Orfeo felt like a crawling worm, unclean, filled with error and sin. He wept once more to the accompaniment of appropriate music. The voice spoke and said, "Beloved friend of earth, we baptize you now in the true light of the worlds eternal." A white flash of lightning blazed forth. His life lay clear before his eyes, and the remembrance of all his previous existences came back to him. He understood the mystery of life. He thought he was going to die, for he knew that at this moment he was wafted into eternity, into a timeless sea of bliss. After this illuminative experience, he came to himself again. Accompanied by the obligatory etheric music, he was borne back to earth. As he left the UFO, it suddenly vanished without trace. Afterwards, on going to bed, he noticed a burning sensation on the left side of his chest. There he found a stigma the size of a 25-cent piece, an inflamed circle with a dot in the middle. He interpreted this as the symbol of the hydrogen atom. His career as an evangelist dates true to form from this experience. He became a witness not only of the word, but of the UFO, and was exposed to the mockery and disbelief that are the lot of the martyr. On the night of August 2 of the same year, he saw, with 8 other witnesses, an ordinary UFO in the sky, which disappeared after a short time. He betook himself to the lonely spot he had previously visited, but though he didn't find the UFO, he met a figure who called out to him, "Greetings, Orfeo." It was the same figure he had seen in the earlier vision, who wished to be called by the name of Neptune. He was a tall, handsome man with unusually large and expressive eyes. The edges of the figure rippled like water in the wind. Neptune gave him more information concerning the earth, the reasons for its lamentable conditions, and its coming redemption. Then he vanished. At the beginning of September 1953, he fell into a somnambulistic state which lasted about a week. When he returned to his normal consciousness, he remembered everything he had experienced during his absence. He had been on a small planetoid where Neptune dwelt with his companion Lyra. Or rather, he had been in heaven as Orfeo imagined it, with countless flowers, delightful odors, colors, nectar and ambrosia, noble etheric beings, and of course, almost incessant music. There he discovered that his heavenly friend was not called Neptune but Orion, and that Neptune had been his own name while he was still dwelling in this heavenly world. Lyra showed him particular marks of attention, to which he, the re-remembered Neptune, in accordance with his earthly nature, responded with erotic feelings, much to the horror of the celestial company. When he had dehabituated himself with some effort from this all-too-human reaction, a nocte celeste is celebrated, a mystic union analogous to the conjunctio oppositorum in alchemy. With this climax, I will end the account of this pelerinage to Lamb. Without having the faintest inkling of psychology, Angelucci has described in the greatest detail the mystic experience associated with a UFO vision. A detailed commentary by me is hardly necessary. The story is so naive and clear that a reader interested in psychology can see at once how far it confirms my previous conclusions. It could even be regarded as a unique document that sheds a great deal of light on the genesis and assimilation of UFO mythology. That is why I have let Angelucci have his say. The psychological experience that is associated with the UFO consists in the vision of the rotundum, the symbol of wholeness, and the archetype that expresses itself in mandala. Mandalas, as we know, usually appear in situations of psychic confusion and perplexity. The archetype thereby constellated represents a pattern of order which, like a psychological viewfinder, marked with a cross or a circle divided into four, is superimposed on the psychic chaos so that each content falls into place and the weltering confusion is held together by the protective circle. The Eastern mandalas in Mahayana Buddhism accordingly represent the cosmic, temporal, and psychological order. At the same time, they are yantras, instruments with whose help order, as our time is characterized by fragmentation, confusion, and perplexity. This fact is also expressed in the psychology of the individual, appearing in spontaneous fantasy images, dreams, and the products of active imagination. I have observed these phenomena in my patients for 40 years and have come to the conclusion that this archetype is of central importance, or rather, that it gains in importance to the degree that the importance of the ego is lost. A state of disorientation is particularly apt to depotentiate the ego. Psychologically, the rotundum or mandala is a symbol of the self. The self is the archetype of order par excellence. The structure of the mandala is arithmetical, for whole numbers are likewise archetypes of order. This is true particularly of the number 4, the Pythagorean tetractys. Since a state of confusion is generally the result of a psychic conflict, we find in practice that the dyad, the conjoined two, is also associated with the mandala. This appears in Angelucci's vision of the synthesis of opposites. Its central position gives the symbol a high-feeling value, expressed, for instance, in Angelucci's stigmatization. The symbols of the self coincide with the God images, as, for instance, the complexio oppositorum of Cusanus with the dyad, or the definition of God as a circle whose center is everywhere and the circumference nowhere, with Angelucci's sign of the hydrogen atom. He was marked not by the Christian stigmata, but by the symbol of the self, of absolute wholeness, or, in religious language, God. These psychological connections gave rise to the alchemical equation between Christ and the lapis philosopher. The center is symbolized by Nanak, the ever-open eye of the fish in alchemy, or the unsleeping God's eye of conscience, or the all-seeing sun. The same symbols are experienced today, not as external light phenomena, but as a psychic revelation. I would like to mention as an example the case of a woman who wrote down her experience. In verse form, it had no connection with UFOs. Vision light strikes the pebbled bottom of a deep blue pool. Through swaying grass a jewel flickers, gleams and turns, demands attention as I pass. A staring fish eye's glance attracts my mind and heart. The fish invisible as glass. A shimmering silver moon, the fish, assuming shape and form, evolves a whirling, swirling dance, intensity of light increasing, The disk becomes a blazing golden sun, compelling deeper contemplation. The water is the depths of the unconscious, into which a ray from the light of consciousness has penetrated. A dancing disk, a fish's eye, swims down below in the inner darkness instead of flying in the heavens, and from it arises a world illuminating sun, and each thighs a soul invictus, an ever-open eye which reflects the eye of the beholder and is at the same time something independent of her, a rotundum that expresses the wholeness of the self and cannot be distinguished, except conceptually, from the deity, fish, ishthais, and sun. Never soul, are allegories of Christ, which like the eye stand for. In the moon and sun appear the Divine Mother and her son lover, as can still be seen today in many churches. The UFO vision follows the old rule and appears in the sky. Orpheus' fantasies are played out in an obviously heavenly place, and his cosmic friends bear the names of stars. If they are not antique gods and heroes, they are at least angels. The author certainly lives up to his name, for just as his wife, ni Borgia ni Nini, is in his opinion a descendant of the Borgias of unhappy memory, so he, an earthly copy of the angels and a messenger bringing Elysian tidings of immortality, must style himself anew Orpheus, divinely appointed to initiate us into the mystery of the UFO. Not even the European strains are lacking. If the name is a deliberately chosen pseudonym, we can only say Ibn Trovato. But if it appears in his birth certificate, then the matter becomes more problematical. Today, we can no longer suppose that a magical compulsion attaches to a mere name, else we should have to attribute a correspondingly sinister significance to his spouse or the anime. Much as we would like to credit him with an intellectually rather limited, naive good faith, it might be suspected that a fine Italian hand is at work. What appears impossible from the conscious standpoint can often be arranged by the unconscious with all the craftiness of nature. Be that as it may, Orpheus' book is an essentially naive production which for that very reason reveals all the more clearly the unconscious background of the UFO phenomenon, and therefore comes like a gift to the science. The individuation process, the central problem of modern psychology, is plainly depicted in it in an unconscious symbolical form which bears out our previous reflections, although the author with his somewhat primitive mentality has taken it quite literally as a concrete happening. This epilogue was already in the press when I received word of Fred Hoyle's book, The Black Cloud, 1957. The author is a well-known authority on astrophysics, and I was already acquainted with his two impressive volumes, The Nature of the Universe and Frontiers of Astronomy. They are brilliant expositions of the latest developments in astronomy and show their author as a bold and imaginative thinker. The fact that such an author should resort to a science fiction story aroused my curiosity, and I read the book at once. Hoyle himself, in his preface, describes it as a frolic, a jest, and warns against anyone identifying the views of his hero, a mathematician of genius, with his own. No intelligent reader will fall into this error, of course. Nevertheless, he will hold Professor Hoyle responsible for the authorship of his book, and he will ask what it was that induced him to tackle the UFO problem in his yarn. Hoyle describes how a young astronomer at the Mount Palomar Observatory, while looking for supernovae to the south of Orion, discovers a dark circular patch in a dense field of stars. It is a so-called globulus, a dark cloud of gas, which it transpires is moving towards our solar system. At the same time, in England, considerable disturbances are detected in the orbits of Jupiter and Saturn. The cause of this is calculated by a Cambridge mathematician, the hero of our story, to be a definite mass, which it then turns out is located exactly at the spot where the Americans discovered the black cloud. This globulus, whose diameter is approximately equal to the distance of the sun from the Earth, consists of hydrogen of fairly high density and is moving straight towards the Earth at 40 miles a second. It will reach the Earth in about 18 months. As the black cloud gets nearer, it causes first of all a terrible heat that kills off a large part of the life on Earth. This is followed by a total extinction of light and a more than Egyptian darkness lasting for about a month. A negrito like that described in the Aurora Consurgens, a treatise ascribed to St. Thomas Aquinas. Beholding from afar, I saw a great cloud looming back over all the earth, which had absorbed the earth and covered my soul. When the light reappears again, there follows a period of terrible cold, which causes another appalling catastrophe. Meanwhile, the scientists in question have been shut up by the British government in their experimental location, where, thanks to the security measures they have taken, they survive the catastrophes. By observing certain remarkable ionization phenomena in the atmosphere, they come to the conclusion that these are intentionally induced, and that in consequence there must be an intelligent in the black cloud. By means of radio, they succeed in entering into communication with it and receive answers. They learn that the cloud is 500 million years old and is at present engaged in regenerating itself. It has taken up its position near the sun in order to recharge itself with energy. In fact, it is feeding on the sun. The scientists discover that the cloud must eliminate all radioactive substances, as these are harmful to it. This fact is also discovered by the American observers, and at their instigation, the cloud is fired at with H-bombs with the intention of killing it. The cloud, meanwhile, has settled in a disk around the sun, consequently threatening the Earth every 6 months, with eclipses of several weeks' duration. The English naturally have a host of questions to ask the cloud, including the metaphysical question concerning a greater being of still greater age, and even deeper wisdom and scientific knowledge. The cloud replies that it has already discussed the matter with others globally, but is as much in the dark about it as human beings. It is willing, however, to communicate its own greater knowledge directly to mankind. A young physicist declares himself ready to submit to the experiment. He gets into a hypnotic condition, but dies of a sort of inflammation of the brain before being able to make any communication. The Cambridge mathematician of genius now offers himself for experiment on the condition, accepted by the cloud, that the process of communication shall take place very much more slowly. In spite of that, he falls into a delirium which ends in his death. The cloud, however, has decided to quit the solar system and seek out another region of fixed stars. The sun emerges again from obscurity and everything is as before, except for the tremendous destruction of earthly life. It is not difficult to see that the author has here taken up the UFO problem so characteristic of our epoch. From outer space, a round object approaches the Earth and causes a worldwide catastrophe. Although the legend usually considers the catastrophic political situation, or rather nuclear fission, to be the indirect cause of the UFO phenomenon, there are not a few people who suspect that the real danger lies in the appearance of UFOs themselves, namely an invasion of the Earth by star-dwellers, which might give an unexpected and probably undesirable turn to our already questionable situation. The strange idea that the black cloud possesses a sort of nervous system and a psyche or intelligence to match is not an original invention of the authors, since speculative ufologists have already arrived at the hypothesis of a sentient electrical field, and also at the idea that the UFOs are provisioning themselves with something on Earth: water, oxygen, small organisms, etc., just as the cloud charged itself with solar energy. The cloud causes opposite extremes of temperature and an absolute nigredo such as the old alchemists dreamed of. This illustrates a characteristic aspect of the psychological problem which arises when the light of day, consciousness, is directly confronted with night, the collective unconscious. Opposites of extreme intensity collide with one another, causing a disorientation and darkening of consciousness, which can assume threatening proportions, as in the initial stage of a psychosis. This aspect, i.e., the energy with a psychic catastrophe, is depicted by Hoyle as the encounter between the psychic content of the cloud and the consciousness of the two unfortunate victims. Just as earthly life is largely wiped out by the collision with the cloud, so the psyche and the life of the two scientists are destroyed by the collision with the unconscious. For although the rotundum is a totality symbol, it usually encounters a consciousness that is not prepared for it and does not understand it. Indeed, is bound to misunderstand it, and therefore cannot tolerate it, because it perceives the totality only in projected form outside itself, and cannot integrate it as a subject phenomenon. Consciousness commits the same grave mistake as the insane person. It understands the event as a concrete external happening and not as a subjective symbolical process. The result is that the external world gets into hopeless disorder and is actually destroyed insofar as the patient loses his relationship to it. The author suggests the analogy with psychosis by the delirious state of the professor. It is not only the insane person who makes this fundamental mistake, but all those who take philosophical or theosophical speculations for objective realities and consider the mere fact that they believe in angels as a guarantee that such things exist in reality. It is significant that it is the actual hero of the story, the mathematician of genius, who meets with disaster. No author can avoid equipping his hero with some of his own qualities and thus betraying that at least a part of himself is invested in him. What happens to the hero also happens symbolically to the author. In this case, it is naturally unpleasant, for it amounts to nothing less than the fear that a collision with the unconscious would involve the destruction of the most differentiated function. It is a widespread, in fact, a normal prejudice that deeper insight into unconscious motives must necessarily entail a fatal disturbance of the conscious performance. The most that can happen is an alteration of the conscious attitude. Since in our story everything is projected outside, mankind and all organic life on earth suffer an immense loss. The author makes no particular to-do about this. It is mentioned only as a sort of byproduct. From this we may infer predominantly intellectual attitude of consciousness, presumably not altogether unimpressed by 100 or more H-bombs, which might well upset its nervous system with their radioactivity. The black cloud withdraws as suddenly as it came. Nothing whatever has been learned of its contents, except that it knows as little about a metaphysical supreme being as we do. Nevertheless, its intelligence proves unendurably high for human beings, so that it comes suspiciously near to having a divine or angel-like nature. Here, the great astrophysicist joins hands with the naive Angelucci. Understood psychologically, the story is a description of fantasy contents whose symbolical nature demonstrates their origin in the unconscious. Whenever a confrontation of this kind occurs, there is usually an attempt at integration. This is expressed in the intention of the cloud to remain for some time near the sun in order to feed on its energy. Psychologically, it would mean that the unconscious draws strength and life from its union with the sun. The sun loses no energy, but the earth and its life, signifying man, lose a great deal. Man has to pay the price for this invasion or eruption of the unconscious. His psychic life is threatened with the gravest injury. What then, psychologically speaking, is the meaning of this cosmic or rather psychic collision? Obviously, the unconscious darkens the conscious, since no rapprochement, no dialectical process takes place between their contents. For the individual, this means that the cloud deprives him of solar energy. In other words, his consciousness is overpowered by the unconscious. This is equivalent to a general catastrophe such as we have experienced in National Socialism and are still experiencing in the communist inundation, where an archaic social order threatens our freedom with tyranny and slavery. Man replies to this catastrophe with his best weapon. Whether for this reason or from a change of mind, it seems more likely, the cloud withdraws to other regions. This means psychologically. The unconscious, after gaining a certain amount of energy, sinks back again to its former distance. Human consciousness and life in general suffer an incalculable loss through an incomprehensible lusus, naturally that lacks all human meaning, a frolic on a cosmic scale. This in turn points to something psychic that is not understood by the present. Though the nightmare is over for the survivors, from now on they live in a devastating consciousness has suffered a loss of its own reality, as though the evil dream had robbed it of something essential and made off with it. The loss consists in missing a unique opportunity which may never occur again to come to terms with the contents of the unconscious. Although it was possible to establish an intelligent connection with the cloud, the communication of its contents proved to be unendurable and led to the death of those who submitted to the experiment. Nothing is learnt of the contents from the other side. The encounter with the unconscious ends bootlessly. Our knowledge is not enriched. On this point, we remain where we were before the catastrophe. The only thing is that we are at least half a world poorer. The scientific pioneers, the spokesmen of the avant-garde, prove too weak or too immature to receive the message from the unconscious. It remains to be seen whether this melancholy outcome is a prophecy or a subject confession. If we compare this tale with the naivetes of Angelucci, we get a valuable picture of the difference between the uneducated and the scientifically educated attitude. Both shift the problem onto a concrete plane, the one in order to make us believe in a saving action from heaven, the other in order to transform this secret, yet somewhat sinister expectation into an entertaining literary joke. Both, poles apart though they are activated by the same unconscious factor and make use of essentially the same symbolism in order to express the unconscious straits we are in. Supplement another recent book, a novel by John Wyndham called The Midwich Cuckoos, 1957, attributes to a thing, which is obviously a UFO, a highly significant character. Of unknown but presumably extraterrestrial origin, this thing casts a spell on a small, remote English village, causing man and beast to fall into a hypnotic sleep which lasts for 24 hours. The zone of sleep describes a circle around the village, and any living being that approaches instantly falls asleep when the magical line is crossed. After 24 hours, everybody revives, and nothing seems to have happened on the surface. 4 weeks later, peculiar discoveries are made. First one, and then another of the female population, and finally all its members capable of fecundation are found to be pregnant. In due course, children are born with golden eyes. When they develop, they begin to show signs of uncommon intelligence. Later it becomes known that the same miracle has befallen a village in Siberia, an Eskimo settlement, and an African village. In England, owing to the remoteness and insignificance of the locality, the village authorities succeed in hushing up a public scandal. The extraordinary intelligence of the children inevitably leads to trouble, and a special school is founded for them. The amazing fact is discovered that if one of the boys has learnt something new and hitherto unknown, all the boys know it, and the same is true of the girls, so that only one boy and one girl have to attend school. Finally, the perspicacious school teacher can no longer doubt that the children with golden eyes represent a superior type of Homo sapiens. Their advanced intelligence is, moreover, coupled with a complete realization of their potential power for world domination. The question of how to deal with this menace leads to different solutions. The Africans killed the children immediately. The Eskimos exposed them to the cold. The Russians, after isolating the village, destroyed by a bombardment. But in England, the favorite teacher introduces some boxes, apparently containing laboratory equipment, but actually containing dynamite, into the schoolroom and blows himself up with all the children. The peculiar parthenogenesis and the golden eyes denote kinship with the sun and characterize the children as divine progeny. Their fathers seem to have been angels of the Annunciation who had come down from a supracelestial place to take care of the stupidity and backwardness of Homo sapiens. It is a divine intervention that gives evolution a definite push forward. Or, to put it in more modern terms, an advanced species of man from some other planet visits the Earth in order to make biological experiments with mutation and artificial insemination. But the modern Neanderthal is in no way ready to renounce the prerogatives of the ruling race and prefers to maintain the status quo by the devastating methods which have always been his final argument. It is obvious that the sun children, miraculously begotten, represent an unexpected capacity for a wider and higher consciousness, superseding a backward and inferior mental state. Nothing is said, however, about a higher level of feeling and morality which would be necessary to compensate and regulate the possibilities of advanced perception and intellect. Characteristically enough, this aspect does not seem to enter the author's field of vision. It is sufficient for him that the children have a definite advantage of some kind over contemporary man. What if the children should symbolize the germ of some higher potentiality transcending the hitherto valid form of man? In that case, the story looks very like a time-honored repetition of the hero's threatened childhood and his early death through treachery. On the other hand, there is something definitely suspect about these children. They are not separated individually, but live in a permanent state of participation mystique or unconscious identity that precludes individual differentiation and development. Had they been spared an early extinction, they would have founded an entirely uniform society, the deadly boredom of which would have been the very ideal of a Marxist state. Thus, the negative end of the story remains a matter for doubt. And of flying saucers, a modern myth of things seen in the skies,